I think to understand the new Taiwan cinema, so-called, we have to know something about the history of filmmaking in Taiwan. There was no filmmaking in Taiwan until really about the 1950s. Taiwan had been a Japanese colony for the first half of the 20th century, and when it was taken over by the Kuomintang government from mainland China, after the Japanese surrender in 45, it was considered just a sort of tropical outpost. It wasn't considered important in any way until the nationalist government retreated there, having lost in the Civil War 4 years later. And at that point, Taiwan suddenly became the last bastion of the Republic of China, while meanwhile, on the mainland, the People's Republic of China was founded. There was no real film production of any seriousness until about the mid-50s, when the nationalist government, the Kuomintang, or KMT, felt exactly as the communists in the mainland did, that it was very useful to use film as a propaganda tool. So the film industry really came into being in Taiwan as an arm of government. And the government did make a certain number of entertainment films, although they were of a very conservative sort. They were designed to reinforce Chineseness. It was a matter of imposing a sense of national identity on the people of Taiwan, many of whom considered themselves more Japanese than Chinese because of 50 years of Japanese occupation. And the Japanese on the whole had been very liberal, and they'd built the railroads, they'd established an education system. They were much liked in many cases. At the same time, there were vestiges of some of Taiwan's Aboriginal tribes around the place who didn't speak Chinese and didn't consider themselves Chinese. And the national language in Taiwan was a dialect called Minnanhua, and it's not Mandarin, which is the imposed national language of China. It was in this context that filmmaking started in Taiwan, and it has to be said that most of it was pretty undistinguished. By the 1970s, when a post-war generation had been born and had come to some kind of maturity, that kind of propaganda filmmaking was looking increasingly threadbare, and there was no audience for it. The film industry was in crisis in Taiwan, simply because the local audience was deserting Taiwanese films. And there was a sense, particularly in the government film office, the Central Motion Picture Corporation, or CMPC, that something had to be done. Well, there were two figures who were under contract to the CMPC at the time. One was called Xiao Ye, and the other was called Wu Nianzhen, because he plays the lead, NJ, in Edward Yang's film quite some years later. These two guys were both hired as scriptwriters at CMPC, and they, between them, took the initiative. They saw what had happened in Hong Kong in the late 70s. They saw that a new generation of mostly Western-trained filmmakers had marched into the film industry as one and had pretty much knocked out the entire older generation in Hong Kong and said, we need some of this in Taiwan. This is the solution to our audience problem. We need a younger spirit. We need a new generation to make films. We have to somehow nurture a new kind of filmmaking in Taiwan. They made the concrete decision that the company, CMPC, should start producing films by new directors. And they figured that the best way to do this initially was to produce omnibus films, or portmanteau films, as they're sometimes called, films with different episodes by different directors. So the first one they did was in, I think, 1981, and it was a film called In Our Time. And it was a film that very consciously, self-consciously, you could say, sketched the modern development of Taiwan across a series of 4 stories. One of them was a film called Desires, directed by Edward Yang. In Our Time, I think, was not a big hit in the Taiwan market, but it was widely noticed, and it was certainly successful enough culturally to be the first of a series. So the second film of this kind that the CMPC produced was a film called The Sandwich Man, which consisted of 3 episodes. And one of those episodes, in fact the episode that gave the film its title, was directed by Hou Xiaoxian. There's nothing like the French New Wave here. In the French New Wave, the magazine Cahiers du Cinéma served as a sort of rallying point for many of the young people who went from being critics or writers about film to becoming filmmakers themselves. And there was no equivalent to that in Taiwan. You know, Edward Yang didn't know Hou Xiaoxian. They moved in entirely separate circles until they found themselves, working for CMPC side by side, not on the same projects. And it was as a result of meeting while doing this job that they ended up collaborating on Edward's film called Taipei Story, which was produced by and starred Hou Xiaoxian. It's fair to say that within a few years, within, let's say, 3-4 years of this first initiative, this new generation of talents had established themselves and established a cultural agenda through their work that had changed Taiwan cinema forever. So I think that's why it came to be known as New Taiwan Cinema. I think the most striking thing about the New Taiwan Cinema, which differentiates it from other new waves around the world, is that in most cases the new waves are very forward-looking. They're designed to address the immediate experiences of young people, people of the generation that are making the film and who are expected to watch it, and about society as it now is, as it's now lived. Taiwan is the diametric opposite. In Taiwan, the need was quite contrarily to reread the past away from all those filters of propaganda and away from all of the restrictions imposed by censorship. So you had a unique case in the world, I think, at that time of a new wave that was backward-looking, but backward-looking to a real point, because it was a matter of restating, rethinking the modern history of Taiwan and presenting it as people had actually lived it and experienced it, and not as the Kuomintang government had presented it. They were also incidentally challenging the censorship taboo, which said that you were not allowed to speak any language other than Mandarin in Taiwan films. Hou Xiaoxian was one of the first to breach that taboo in his episode for The Sandwich Man by insisting on having some of the dialogue in Taiwanese dialect. In addition to all of those circumstantial changes and breaking through censorship and that kind of stuff, there was, I think, a determination on the part of most of the people who made New Taiwan cinema in the early 80s to also rethink the language and film language and style of filmmaking. For example, one of the things that was never done was sync sound shooting, as it was crucial to convey some sense of reality and to give the actors some autonomy of performance.
Why are we afraid of the first time? Every day in life is a first time. Every morning is new. We never live the same day twice. We never afraid of getting up every morning. Why?
So a lot of filmmakers from the very word go rejected the idea of post-syncing. They insisted on shooting with sync sound. At the same time, people like Hou Xiaoxian, who was never foreign trained, he pioneered, for reasons that have been endlessly discussed since, the use of long take scenes. He shot predominantly in long shot. It was a kind of filmmaking with very, very few close-ups in it, and takes tended to be quite extended in duration, so that the action would unfold often from some distance, but at length. In a master shot, a single master shot, with no inserts, no cross-cutting, no details, minimal use of close-ups at any point in the film, he said that he was tired of the old ways of doing it, and he was driven, for reasons he couldn't exactly articulate, to experiment with something new. And he had noticed that if you did extend a take and you didn't cut, it created a kind of tension in the performances that was otherwise not there. If the actors were going to be contributing anything to the scene, it was materially helped if you didn't cut, if you allowed the scene its own kind of duration and autonomy, and then the interaction, whatever was happening between the actors on the screen, could develop in its own way and build up its own tension and its own dynamic, and it would not be something imposed on the scene by the filmmaker who would be playing around with film language. So for him, this became a kind of article of faith, and other Taiwan filmmakers also tended, again, without the rather strict formalism that came to dominate Hou Xiaoxian's practice, they tended to go for extended shots. They saw it as a way of not falling into the traps of old cinema. It was an instinctive reaction against the kind of sloppy cinematography, the random frenetic zooming, the atrocious use of substandards and anamorphic lenses that had characterized 1970s genre filmmaking in Taiwan. And it was an attempt to produce something of a technically higher standard, accompanied by sync sound and with, a closer contact with the realities of everyday life. Edward Yang was also led towards longer takes, not in quite such a formalist way as Ho Xiaoxian. I think you could say that Edward's films, by contrast, are very different in character, very different in structure, very different in style, but have, broadly speaking, the same concerns underpinning them. So Edward also is trying to find ways of talking both about the politics since the 1950s in Taiwan, the social changes, the forces, particularly political forces, but also economic and cultural, that impact on people's lives and made them what they are, make them behave the way that they do. And at the same time, he's trying to find ways to talk about the present day. And I think A One and a Two, or Yi Yi, is probably the richest example of a film in which he seeks to find a way to talk about Taiwan now. I think Edward is the most intellectual, probably, of the Taiwan new cinema directors. And he has always approached his films quasi-scientifically in terms of their structures and their social spread, their themes. Well, Edward grew up in this rather constrained environment. His parents wished for him to become a professional, a high-earning professional. They wanted him to be like a doctor or a scientist or something like that. I mean, he could have been, the Bill Gates of Taiwan. He went off to the States to study computer design, computer engineering, mechanical engineering in the broadest sense, thereby conforming to the wishes of his parents, like a good filial Chinese son. In the States, he gradually yielded to his desire to be involved in the arts. He was tugged in a different direction by his own impulses, which were increasingly towards film. And I think he said several times in interviews that the filmmaker who struck him most forcibly around that time was Werner Herzog. And he felt that this was the kind of cinema that he wanted to pursue. Films like Aguirre, Wrath of God, and even Dwarf Started Small and Heart of Glass. I think his films have been about equally balanced between investigations of the present, anatomies of the structures and dynamics of present-day Taiwan society. And as I say, he's approached these things very intellectually in the sense that he has constructed increasingly intricate plots, often involving disparate groups of characters who interact to some degree, but often have autonomous action as well. And inviting the audience to build up a composite picture by observing all of these different people in their different situations and seeing how what they do impacts on each other and ultimately adds up to some broader picture which offers us some sense of what Taiwan is and has been. Edward Yang became so disillusioned with the processes of distribution and marketing in Taiwan that he has, to this day, never allowed One and a Two to be released in Taiwan. So the film has not been seen in Taiwan. Insofar as anybody knows the film in Taiwan, it's by repute or by imported DVDs. One of the characteristics of all new wave movements is that they break up. People end up not speaking to each other and end up, in some cases, deeply alienated from each other. And that certainly happened in Taiwan, just as it happened in France, just as it happened in Germany and in plenty of other countries too. That kind of collaborative working together, a sense of common purpose, a sense of shared project, lasted probably 3-4 years before it petered out and people started to go in their separate directions. The Taiwan film business is now effectively dead.